The Prime Minister says the UK is now seeing a second wave, with the number of new infections doubling every week and hospital admissions rising. Well, at least 13.5 million people, roughly 1 in 5 of the UK population, are already facing local restrictions. In London, additional measures are increasingly likely, according to the Mayor, Sadiq Khan, who says he's extremely concerned by the evidence of speed with which the virus is spreading in the capital. It comes as governments across Europe have also announced new restrictions to tackle the surge in infections, including a lockdown in parts of the Spanish capital, Madrid. The UK government is understood to be considering a short period of tighter rules across England, a so-called circuit break, which could include a ban on households mixing and reduced opening hours for pubs and restaurants. Simon Jones reports.
Closing time came early last night in Newcastle. A 10 p.m. finish, part of new restrictions for much of the North East, which also see people from different households banned from socialising at home.
If that's law, it's law. But if people would behave themselves, it wouldn't be like this.
I just think people are going to go out during the day now instead of going out at night, so it's not going to really change anything.
It's good because it's saving people's lives, bad because it's infecting when it's out.
A slow night and an early finish too for this fast food business.
I don't think it's going to make any difference. The virus doesn't die at 10 o'clock.
But with infection rates rising, more than 13 million people in the UK are now facing lockdown measures. Life is starting to look different, with new test centres opening up in places like Glasgow. New restrictions come in next week in Merseyside, parts of the Midlands and West Yorkshire. And in Lancashire, like here in Accrington, though Blackpool is exempt due to lower infection rates. The latest government figures show the highest daily number of new cases since the current surge began, with more than 4,300 in the last 24-hour period. That means the average number reported per day in the past week is 3,466. Yesterday, the Prime Minister met scientists trying to develop a vaccine.
That's fantastic. That's what you have to call.
Today he'll be in Downing Street, where he'll consider stopping people who don't live together meeting and making all bars and restaurants in England close at 10 p.m.
We are now seeing a second wave coming in, and I don't think anybody wants to go into a second lockdown. But clearly, when you look at what is happening, you've got to wonder whether we need to go further.
Here in London, this is the first weekend that the so-called rule of 6 has been in place, limiting the number of people who can gather in groups. The government will be looking very closely at the effect that has on coronavirus rates. But the Mayor of London says it's increasingly likely that further restrictions will be needed here too. And he says the government shouldn't wait until the virus spirals out of control. Boris Johnson is desperate to avoid a second full national lockdown, but he knows that the time for tough decisions is fast approaching. Simon Jones, BBC News.
Well, our political correspondent Jonathan Blake is here. Jonathan, I heard Neil Ferguson, who was a former chief, obviously it's an advisor to the government on this scientifically, saying that the UK is approximately where we were at the end of February now. If we leave it 2 to 4 weeks before imposing, say, much further restrictions across the whole of England, we could be where we were in mid-March. Nobody wants to see that. How likely is it that we're going to get tighter restrictions quickly?
I think it is likely that there will be a decision in the coming days which will see a tightening of restrictions potentially in more regions across England, which of course the Westminster government has responsibility for, and potentially even at a national level. What the government is desperate to avoid is a return to the lockdown which we saw earlier in the year, which saw most workplaces closed, public transport severely reduced, schools, universities, colleges closed, etc. But the number of cases is doubling every 7 to 8 days at the moment, and from what the Prime Minister said yesterday, it is very clear that the government is considering taking action at a national level. So I think it is more a case of when and not if we see that. So what would it look like? Well, there are a number of plans under discussion in government at the moment. One possibility is a 3-tier approach where you have at one end basic social distancing measures, what is in place at the moment across most of England, the so-called rule of 6. Beyond that, you stop households mixing and start closing hospitality businesses and restricting their hours beyond that. there is the strictest form of lockdown which we saw earlier this year. Then there's the other option of what is being described as this circuit break approach. So a time-limited, perhaps 2-week temporary period of tighter restrictions at a national level to attempt to slow the reinfection rate, slow the spread of the virus down so that further restrictions aren't necessary. And answering whether Labour would support that this morning, the party's deputy leader, Angela Rayner, said that they would support the government if it were to go down that route, but those restrictions at this point shouldn't be necessary.
Labour will do whatever it takes to keep our British citizens safe, and therefore if the science says that's what needs to happen, then we're willing to support that. But I have to say that I think that this could have been avoided if the government had got their testing and tracing system in place. And now we're having to look at more extreme measures because the virus is out of control, and that could have been avoidable.